septum, I've seen this question on the final at times. So, which of the following contribute to the nasal septum? Which of these contribute to the nasal septum? A, ethmoid, B, vomer, C, cartilage, D, all of them, E, A, and B only.
Vomer and the cartilage.
Well, actually, it's all of them, because the upper portion of the septum is ethmoid, the lower portion, bone-wise, is vomer, but anterior to both is septal cartilage. Cartilage contributes the whole length to protect cushion, ethmoid, and vomer, so it's ethmoid, vomer, and cartilage. Even though it's vague, they just say cartilage, that is an answer, because there is septal cartilage in the nasal septum. Okay, so all of them, that's the three components of the nasal septum. Now, I said this a couple of minutes ago, but there are four bones. They're not going to ask the number, but there are four bones that contribute to the hard palate. The two maxillaries and the two palatines. That's another way of saying it. There are four bones that contribute to your hard palate. Most of it is the two maxillaries, but the posterior part of the two palatines. And, let's see, that's septum. The other one would be, I'll do sinuses at the very end, because I have to write something. So, the 7 auxiliary bones of the skull, 6 ossicles, 1 hyoid. 6 ossicles and 1 hyoid make up the 7 auxiliary bones. I can't find a hyoid right now. Oh, yeah, okay. There's very little that they're going to ask. So the ossicles are in the temporal bone. Just know, because they're the little bones that vibrate as part of hearing, it's very complicated. Just know, ossicles, malleus, incus, stapes, 3 ossicles in each temporal bone, part of hearing. So that's 6. There are 3 little tiny ossicles that vibrate as part of hearing. They're located in the temporal bone. The temporal bone has everything to do with hearing. So the 6 ossicles, 3 in each temporal bone. For the hyoid, the only thing you need to know is only bone of 206 that does not, it's sort of a no man's land between, I don't want to spend time on this because it's not on the test, but it's between your mandible and voice box. So it's in no man's land, but it is considered a skull bone, but it's the only bone of the skull of the 29, which we're not asking, but it's the only skull bone that does not articulate with any other bone. It's the only bone of the 206. It's the only bone in the whole skeleton that's considered, it's attached to the temporal by ligaments. There are long ligaments, which we're not going to ask, that attach it to the temporal, but does not articulate with any other bone. Hyoid does not articulate with any other bone. Lots of muscle attachment. So lots of muscle attachment, but does not articulate with any other bone. And now sinuses, I'm going to write sinuses of skull. You know, if we don't ask really function or anything like that, I just need to know which are paranasal, which isn't. So if I write the names of the sinuses, or which skull bones housing sinuses, because they overlap cranial and facial, actually. So I'll just put skull bones housing sinuses. There's no particular order except for the last part. Skull, bones, and we don't ask numbers of these. You just need to know which are paranasal, meaning drain into nasal cavity, which not. Skull bones housing these large air cavities that drain into the mainly nasal cavity. So frontal bones have, how many, don't worry about, but frontal bones have sinuses. Maxillary bones, each one has a large sinus, but just know maxillary bones have sinuses. Then sphenoid, and it's in the body of the sphenoid. I've seen that once in a while. So it's the only thick part of the sphenoid. The sinus is in the body of sphenoid. Now that's one giant sinus, but just sphenoid houses a sinus, and ethmoid, many little ones, they're in the lateral masses. So the ethmoidal sinuses are deep in those side walls, which are very thick. So ethmoid bones, sphenoid bone, ethmoid, bone, in lateral masses of ethmoid. I draw a line. So these are paranasal. All of these sinuses, and whether frontal, maxillary, sphenoid, which is in the body behind the nasal cavity, ethmoid in the side walls, all of these drain into the nasal cavity. So all of these, no exception, these are the paranasal. The sinuses in these four bones, frontal, four named bones. I mean, the numbers get, there's pairs and unpaired. Don't worry about that. Just know the names: frontal, maxillary, sphenoid, ethmoid. Those are the paranasal sinuses. Those are paranasal sinuses because they drain into nasal cavity. Now, there's no comparable name for number 5. It's just not paranasal because it couldn't drain there. It drains into your middle ear, which we don't ask, but not paranasal. Not are temporal bones, but I'll put it as 5. That's the last of the 5 names. Temporal bones have sinuses, and they're in the mastoid portion, because there's only 2 thick parts of the temporal. This part, which it's Petra's portion, but it's not on the final. That houses the middle and inner ears. That's occupied. So you don't want to put sinuses there. But the mastoid is the other thick portion. It's full of little sinuses. And it can't drain to nasal, so it actually drains right next into the middle ear, but we don't ask that. You just need to know the mastoid sinuses or the temporal sinuses, they go by both names, are not paranasal. So they're in mastoid processes. And they're not paranasal. They don't drain. The others drain into nasal cavity, so they're called paranasal. The one that's not paranasal are in the mastoid processes of temporal bones. They're in the mastoid processes of the temporal bones. Okay. And so there's always a question, which are paranasal? And they just go by the names here: frontal, maxillary, sphenoid, ethmoid, paranasal. Which is not paranasal? That's the other question. Or all are paranasal except. All are paranasal except, and the one that's not paranasal in that question is temporal. Sometimes they put mastoid sinuses or mastoid, temporal, mastoid, or they just might put temporal bones. Either way, that's the only one that's not paranasal. Okay, so I finished. That's everything on skull, actually. Any questions on axial? That finishes axial skeleton. So I'm going to do movements very quickly, because I think you know this code. My guess is you do, and there's maybe 1 or 2 questions on movements that are very straightforward. So, so I'm not going to spend much time on movements. This is just all you need to know is the movements through the sagittal plane are basically flexion, extension. They're in flexion everywhere. The knee flexes posteriorly, don't worry about it, but flexion, extension, sagittal plane. Mm-hmm. In the ankle, you just say dorsiplantar. It's still sagittal plane. In the ankle joint, you just say dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. So everywhere else you say flexion, extension, even neck, trunk. But in the ankle, you just say dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. It's all sagittal plane. Coronal plane, mostly we say ADD towards the center, ADD or ABD away from midline. Towards the midline, ADD, away from midline, ABD. At wrist, you could use adduct, abduct, but we also use ulnar deviation. It's legitimate. These are coronal plane. Ulnar deviate towards the ulna, and radial deviation towards the radius. So that's still coronal plane, ulnar deviation, radial deviation. And neck trunk, lateral, side bending or lateral flexion is coronal plane. Side bending, lateral flexion left, lateral flexion right for neck. So basically it's adduct, abduct, wrist, ulnar deviate, radial deviate, neck trunk, lateral flexion. All that's coronal plane. Transverse plane, mainly rotational movement. Rotational movement, the main type of movement through the transverse plane is rotational movement. So at hip and shoulder, you use medial rotation, lateral rotation. That's the big one because those are so movable. Medial rotation, lateral rotation is transverse plane movement. But in your forearm, or really your proximal and distal radial ulnar joints allow rotation only. I'll do that when we do joints. But so pronation is if you turn a doorknob to the left with your right hand. If you turn a doorknob to your left or counterclockwise, but that's confusing. If this way is pronation, the palmar surface, or basically rotational movement of hands so that palmar surface turns posteriorly. That's pronation. It's coming from your radial ulnar. That's pronation. Don't worry about the foot pronation, even though that's used. It's not on the test. Just here. The only place you need to know pronationiform, supinationiform, like serving soup, or a palm turns anteriorly. So rotational movement so that palm turns anteriorly is supination. This is supination. This is pronation. Supinationiform, pronation. It's rotation, pronation, supination, pronation, supination. Okay. And the other, you could say rotation right, rotation left for neck, trunk. That's still transverse rotation of neck or trunk, left, right. But the hard one is not really, if you horizontal add or horizontal ab in the shoulder, it's still transverse plane, even though really not rotation. That's a tricky one. So horizontal ADD, horizontal ab is still transverse plane movement. That's considered transverse plane movement. And then the specialized movements, the movements that don't quite fit, there's four definitions. The easiest one, straight up, elevation, straight down, depression. So basically, mandible, scapula or shoulder girdle, ribs, even though it doesn't, we count ribs for elevate, depress, and we count hyoid. So ribs, elevate, depress, hyoid, elevate, depress, mandible, elevate, depress, and you could either say scapula or shoulder girdle elevates, depress. For protract, retract, pure anterior, only mandible and scapula. So scapula, that's protract, scapula, retract, scapula, pro, scapula, re, mandible, pro, mandible, re. Okay, so only scapula and mandible for protract, retract. Now the one that I forgot, actually I'll show this, and then I'll put in something I forgot. There was one thing on the foot, we did bones of the foot that I forgot, and I'll remedy that, but, okay. Oh yeah, only the foot inverts, that's plantar surface turns medially or towards midline. That's inversion, only at the foot, actually only at the intertarsal joints. It's really the intertarsal joints, not the ankle. So intertarsal joints or foot invert, inversion of foot, plantar surface turns medially or towards midline. And then eversion, plantar surface turns outward or away from midline. Inversion of foot, that's a foot action, not an ankle joint action. Inversion of foot, eversion of foot. Inversion is at the foot only, inversion. Then the foot turns laterally, the plantar surface turns laterally or outward, it's eversion. And the only other one I believe is upward, scapula specialized, only scapula upwardly rotate. You use the glenoid fossa, but it's not an issue. Just know the only bone that can upwardly rotate and downwardly rotate, it's only used for scapula, it's not used for anything else. Scapula tilts up, it's upward rotation. Scapula tilts down, downward. Upward rotation scapula, downward rotation scapula. Scapula only. And what I forgot, I'll give you it in question form. Plantar flexion, dorsiflexion is a function, can be performed by which of these joints? Plantar flexion, dorsiflexion of foot. Plantar flexion, dorsiflexion of ankle, foot. is performed by which of these joints? A, ankle joint only, B, intertarsal joints only, C, both, D, neither. The dorsiflex plantarflex is performed by which of these? A, ankle joint only, B, intertarsal joints only, C, both, D, neither. Ankle only. The ankle does not, this is very loose here, but the ankle can only, it's pure hinge. It can only, getting too crowded, okay. I'm here by myself, but, okay. So ankle joint, pure hinge, only dorsiplantar, nothing else. This is snugger, that was too loose. But the intertar, actually the other similar question, inversion, eversion of the foot, same choices, is performed or is a function of which joints? So the ankle joint only gives dorsiplantar, nothing else, pure hinge. But if you say inversion of foot, eversion of foot, inversion, eversion, performed or function of which joints? A, ankle joint only, B, intertarsal joints only, C, both, D, neither. It's intertarsal joints only. The ankle does not contribute, you can't tell from outside, but the inversion, eversion is intertarsal joints only, working together. Inversion, eversion is a function of intertarsal joints only, the invert, intertarsal joints only, and you can see they're not involved in dorsiplantar is ankle joint only. The dorsiflexion, plantarflexion is ankle, there's always one or the other on the final. So dorsiflexion, plantarflexion, ankle joint only. Inversion, eversion, intertarsal joints only. That's the important thing.